We want to welcome you this evening to our final speaker in our Parenting in a Pandemic speaker series. We were very grateful to receive a grant from National PTA and TikTok to be able to put on as many speaker series as we did. So this is our 17th speaker in the whole year, and we are so grateful that you have all joined us and come along with us on this journey for better mental health, distance learning support, tips and tricks, and we're really excited to finish out this final installment with you all. Tonight's talk will be creating a culture of compassion and integrity. And we're very excited because we think that's very relevant to what's happening in the news, what's happening with all of us. And we heard it best a couple nights ago that next year for our schools is going to be a year of healing, as the schools and our parents and all of the relationships that we've continued to build continue to heal, and we continue to do everything we can for every child with one voice. I want to say thank you to Elena Shea, who was our VP of Health and Community Concerns, who was also the chair of our Parenting in a Pandemic Speaker Series committee, and to all of our board who were welcome hosts or tech hosts. And I will now turn it over to Anna Thompson, our parliamentarian, and our luncheon chair, who will be this is her event, so.
Good evening, everyone. I can't tell you how pleased I am to welcome Erin Gruwell and her associate, John Paul. And I'd say your last name, John, but I probably would butcher it. So I'm gonna not embarrass myself with that. Erin is a phenomenal person, teacher, education activist, and the founder of the Freedom Writers Foundation. In fact, a couple weeks ago, my son and I watched Freedom Writers again, and as he said earlier, you better have Kleenex, because it was the most touching story. And to give credit to Erin, she is a graduate of University of California, Irvine, and she's earned her master's degree and was teaching at Wilson High School. And she created the Freedom Writer Methods, a progressive teaching philosophy and curricula designed to achieve excellence from all students. And I just have to say that we are so pleased to have you tonight, and I'm not going to use any more of your time and turn the time over to you, Erin. Welcome.
Thank you. I love that we are all either in our pajamas or at home and gathered here tonight. PTA for me is family. And if I've learned anything from the Freedom Writers, family is what we make and family is what we choose. And I learned that lesson very early on. So as I share lessons about my fabulous family, the Freedom Writers, I hope I'm just holding up a mirror to your 6th district. I hope that I'm just explaining anecdotes of the kids that you humbly serve, whether you are a teacher, a parent, an active person in the community, or a student watching tonight. We are all in this together. And I think that sometimes hardship makes us stronger. And I know that is to be the case for the Freedom Writers. Our story didn't start in a pandemic, but our story did start immediately after the Los Angeles riots. And when I reflect on this year with all of that social unrest and the racial reckoning that we have started and will continue to have with courageous conversations, when my students were just in middle school, our community was rocked to the core. There was that verdict, there was that spark, and almost overnight, Los Angeles erupted in flames. I tell you that because my students at that time were at a really tender age, fight or flight. And a lot of my students in that pandemonium reached for their fist, reached for a gun, reached for that Molotov cocktail, and just decided to destroy. And what I love about our story later is it wasn't about destruction. It was about creation, building rather than tearing down, creating a bridge rather than building a wall. So as I watched all of that pandemonium happen on television, I could smell the smoke in the air. I could feel the ash. I didn't realize what would be walking into room 203 And what walked into room 203 was angry, disgruntled kids at the age of 14 who would rather push me away than pull me a little closer, who would rather push all of those feelings and those stories down rather than pick up a pen and tell their story. So, throughout this presentation tonight, I'd love to share some of those stories, some of those fairy faces, and those beautiful anecdotes. And I want to start with one student in particular. His name is Carlos. And unfortunately, when Carlos was just a mere baby, 6 months old, he was abandoned. And I learned that when he raised his hand one day to ask me a question. And I looked at him, and at that time he was big and burly. He still is pretty big and still pretty burly. But I'd heard some toxicity in that teacher's lounge about this kid. You know, he'd already been kicked out of every school he'd ever attended. And unbeknownst to him, he was already a part of this school to prison pipeline. They just discarded. They just got rid of. They put him on the margins and the fringe. So when he raised his hand, he asked, "Do you think I was an ugly baby?" And I thought, oh, you know, what kind of question is that? So I said, "Of course not, Carlos. There is no such thing as an ugly baby." His retort was, "Well, I must have been. Or why else would my mom have abandoned me when I was 6 months old?" And it hit me. Here was this tender teenager who was big and burly, and yet he was broken. There was a hole in his heart that needed healing. Yes, he pushed away rather than pull closer. And yes, he pushed down rather than let it out. And I realized with Carlos and so many of my students, what I had to do was to listen, to learn, and eventually love. Things I didn't learn in a textbook or in the halls of academia, but things I learned in that very classroom. What I learned in that teacher's lounge, though, was really disturbing. They had stereotypes and stigmas. They had statistics and rap sheets to prove it. And they were ready to pounce on Carlos at any moment and send him away. You see, at that time, Carlos was a graffiti artist, and he wrote on every stretch of a desk, a wall, a locker, a freeway overpass, you name it, he put his name. And the name of choice back then was Idol, like American Idol. He wanted to feel big. He wanted to be bold. He didn't like feeling like that broken boy, that baby that was abandoned at 6 months old. So Carlos sat in one corner, and every once in a while out would come that marker, out would come that piece of art, out would come something that would allow him to be seen for just a moment. In the other corner sat another boy, equally as broken. And unlike Carlos, who was abandoned at 6 months old, this boy was abandoned in the belly. His mom got pregnant when she was in high school. And sadly, that boy that said he loved her bounced. He didn't want to stick around to be a dad, to take care of someone when he was still in high school. So when Sharad was born, he didn't know his dad. In fact, he didn't meet his father until he was almost 7 years old and in second grade. He spent the better part of his childhood wondering and wishing, crossing his fingers and thinking, maybe, just maybe, my dad will come home on this Christmas or this birthday. To no avail. No matter how hard he tried, no matter how many times he crossed his fingers, no matter how many times he did the sign of the cross, his father never came home. When he was 7, finally, his pops wanted to meet his boy. And so Sharad got all gussied up in his Sunday finest. And he wondered, is he going to stick around this time? Will he bring me a present? Will he take me out to get that burger and fries, maybe with that little souvenir shake? Will he teach me how to play ball? Will he tuck me into bed at night? Will he help me with those ABCs and those 1, 2, 3s? Sadly, about 7 minutes in to that burger, those fries, and that shake, Things weren't right, and things weren't normal. Daddy had the shakes. Daddy broke out in a cold sweat. Daddy was a junkie. And Daddy hit up his boy, his 7-year-old son, for his allowance. And I have this vision of this little boy going and getting this ceramic piggy bank filled with pennies, nickels, and dimes to give it to a pops who yet again is going to break his heart. So in my classroom, in these opposite corners, sat Carlos and Sharad. And just like that city that erupted in flames, at any moment, something could go wrong. And in fact, it did. In fact, we had our own crash, boom, bam moment, because one day, out came that marker, out came a piece of paper, and a horrible racist caricature was drawn. Across the bottom, it had these words in all caps, "Pass me," and off it went like a blaze, like a forest fire. It went down one row of students and there was laughter, there was high fives, there was fist bumps. It went down a second row and there was more laughter, more high fives, more fist bumps. And when it finally got into the hands of Sharad, I had noticed that this tough boy wasn't so tough after all. In fact, I saw that knot in his throat. I saw his fist clench. And I realized at any moment those tears were going to well in his eyes. I think he just wanted to disappear. I think he just wanted to crawl under that table. I think he was waiting for the bell to ring because fist to cuffs in that hall, on that quad, or out on the streets. When I intercepted that note, something inside of me just shouted, "Do something." I didn't know how or where or what, but that note evoked this anger, almost like a rage, and it was pure fear. Because what happens when the bell does ring? What happens when these kids are in that hallway or out on the quad or on the streets? In our city, you see, we had 126 murders in a single year after those riots. I didn't want 127. I didn't want to come to school and check out and then be a pallbearer. I didn't want to stand in an assembly line at a funeral parlor. And I certainly didn't want to give a eulogy for another student, babies killing babies. So in that moment, seeing that note, understanding my broken boys, what I wanted to do was to have some kind of shock value, to have them understand that pain is pain. And as I was yelling and screaming and trying to build some kind of bridge, a bridge of understanding, I used a comparison to a situation that none of my students understood. I talked about the Holocaust. And then up came a hand, out came another question. And yet again, it was Carlos. He said, "What is that? What is that word you just used? What is the Holocaust?" My students didn't read books. They didn't watch documentaries. And if they missed that day in history, they could have missed an entire year, an entire season, an entire atrocity. So in that moment, I realized I have to teach with my students, not at them. I have to bring these subjects to life. And little by little, I have to show them that in this moment, I'm not going to send them away. I'm not going to punish them, but they have to understand that pain is pain. I didn't realize all those years ago, decades would go by, and that Carlos would stop calling me Miss G and start calling me Mama G. That broken boy, that boy that was abandoned, that boy that used to search for self, search for where he was going to sleep, search for what he was going to eat every single night, would become my greatest ally, a champion, an advocate. So when I was asked to be a part of this 6-district speaker series, I got a little nervous when they said that not only did the National PTA grant them these wonderful opportunities, but also TikTok. I can't sing, I can't dance, I don't even have my own TikTok account. But I realized that if I could bring a story to life with another face, with another anecdote, I could do just that. So I asked Carlos, who's no longer that broken boy, to come to our office. He said, absolutely, Mama. And for a little context, in the middle of this pandemic, Carlos showed up at our office. For context, I'm a teacher. I drive a 2006 Prius. Well, Carlos showed up and he had a brand new BMW. You see, Carlos is no longer that broken boy, no longer homeless, no longer searching for self. Carlos is a baller. Carlos is a businessman. Carlos is on a fast track to being a millionaire, owning his own business. So Carlos shows up. We do our elbow bumps. I wanted to give him a big bear hug in the midst of a pandemic. And when he showed up, I noticed something that I had never really saw before. Like so many Marvel characters, so many DC comics, they have something that's like their shield. If you're Captain America, you actually have a shield. If you are Superman, you have a cape and colorful underwear. If you're Iron Man, you got the suit. Well, Carlos is not a superhero, but when Carlos showed up that very day, he was wearing his Ray-Bans, his shades, his superhero power. When he sat down to make this video for you, I said, Carlos, you got to take off the shades. You got to look at the camera. And my hope was that by taking off that superhero shield, that you would see what I see. Not the BMW, not the businessman, but that boy with all of those feelings. You'd actually see that lump in the throat. You'd actually see the tears well in his eyes, the crack of his voice. And more than anything, you would see humanity. He did just that. So for a brief moment, I want to introduce you to my boy, my beautiful boy, Carlos. And for a moment, he's not going to dance and sing, but his words will. And for a moment, he's going to take each and every one of you back into my classroom, back into room 203, back to that moment with that pen, with that piece of paper, that horrible caricature, and that moment where he raised his hand, asked that fateful question, and changed everything. So this is my beautiful boy, Carlos.
Being a Mexican American, growing up in Long Beach, and it was a lot of gang violence. Hispanics sticking with Hispanics, blacks with blacks, Asians with Asians. Especially around that time, there was a lot of problems with everyone against the Hispanics, all the gangs against the Hispanics. I wasn't a gang member, I used to be a tagger. I just will stick to my own. One of my favorite scenes is actually, there was an incident that happened in the classroom. There was a paper that was being passed around, and it turned out that that picture was making fun of Sharad. I was like, wow, he's gonna come back with a kind of comeback or something, but he was actually pretty hurt.
What is that?
That's when Ms. G actually took the paper and saw it, and she started talking to us about racism and what the Nazis did in World War II.
They'd print pictures like this in the newspapers. Jewish people with big, long noses. Blacks with big, fat lips. They'd also publish scientific evidence that proved Jews and blacks were the lowest form of human species. In fact, life would be a whole lot better if they were all dead. That's how a Holocaust happens.
That's when the big question came up. That's when I raised my hand and I asked her, what is that? What is the Holocaust? She asked everyone.
Raise your hand if you know what the Holocaust is.
That scene right there, it took me back in time. And I was just remembering sitting there watching Ms. G after that incident happened in real life, that I lived it. It changed my ways of thinking towards other races. It made me realize that we all get cut, we all bleed the same color. If that movie can help other kids, If they can make other teachers better, it makes me feel great. It's an honor being part of this. Honestly, I wouldn't change it for anything in this world.
In the midst of a pandemic, for Carlos to sit on that chair next to a chalkboard and make that video as an adopted mom of sorts, it makes my spirit soar. And when I think about Carlos now, I don't think about the shiny rims on that beautiful car. I don't think about those tattoos. I think of who he's become. He's a father. He was part of our PTA. In fact, his daughter went off to California State University in Long Beach and got straight A's, even in the midst of a pandemic. And you see, when you are abandoned at 6 months old, that does something to your psyche. Things aren't right. Things aren't normal. You're always searching. Where am I going to sleep? On someone's couch? On that park bench? Maybe in the corner of an alley. You're always searching for what you're going to eat. When we're not in a pandemic, my kids would get to school as early as they could to get that free breakfast before anybody else saw. They got that free lunch. But for kids like Carlos, I always wondered what happened at night, what happened on weekends, what happened when we weren't in school. So Carlos would dumpster dive. What happens when you're growing, like most boys do, and your jeans are torn and tattered? I would often catch Carlos taking my stapler and patching up his jeans, or taking a cardboard box and putting it at the bottom of his sneakers. No wonder he pushed away rather than pulling closer. And so now, every May 10th on Mexican Mother's Day, Carlos shows up with a big bouquet of red roses, and I get to be that mama. Family is what we make. Family is what we choose. What happened after that note, that moment, that crash, boom, bam, teachable moment, there was an invisible light bulb, this aha. And I wanted each and every one of my students to let me in the way that Carlos did. But I knew it wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't be overnight. So I decided to be a little sneaky, to be a little subversive. You see, when I was in college, something happened. I watched something on my old school television, the kind with those rabbit ears, in my dormitory. It was a moment. Many of you might have seen it in real time, and some of you might have seen it on television or Google afterwards. What felt like a world away, in the middle of Tiananmen Square, there was a man standing in front of a tank, and he doubled down. He doubled down as if to say, run me over. And I watched live and in real time. I didn't even know his name. I didn't even know his story. I didn't even know what he was standing up to or for or about. But I figured if he's standing in front of a tank for the world to watch, it has to be bigger than himself. In that humbling moment, sitting in my dorms with my old school television with those rabbit ears, I realized I had never stood up for anything. I'd never stood up to anyone. I didn't even have the courage or the conviction to stand up to a mean girl. And here's somebody across the globe who is standing in front of a tank, be it for democracy or an education. Something bigger, something bolder, something better. I wanted my students to stand up for something. And so what I decided to do is, in this sneaky moment of mine, I was going to take everything out of my classroom, every chair, every desk, every number 2 pencil, every ballpoint pen, everything. Because for students like Carlos, school made them feel less than. School kept them on that fringe or in the margins or made them feel invisible. And so I wanted to clear that classroom. And then I put this piece of tape down the center of my class. And that piece of tape was going to be this gravitational pull. They would stand on a wall, look at one another, and I would ask a series of questions. But what I knew was my competition was anything and everything that took place outside of room 203. Fashion, pop culture, that song, that movie, that Marvel character, that athlete, that icon, everything that didn't involve a textbook, a number 2 pencil, or a Scantron. So the first questions I asked were kind of silly. You know, stand on the line if you have the new Snoop Dogg CD. Well, that was big. That was big back in the 90s because this skinny, scrawny kid named Calvin Brodus III lived down the street from most of my students. In fact, Calvus Brodus III would show up at VIP Records or MLK Park on a Tuesday. So every single one of my students knew Calvin Brodus III, Snoop Dogg. So of course, every single one of my students stood on that line. And in fact, most of my students thought at any moment, Dr. Dre is going to walk into room 203 and we too will be on MTV like those music videos. For you young folk, there was actually a time that MTV used to play music videos. You don't believe me, but back in the day, they did. So there was some snickers, there was some laughter, and kids were staying on that line thinking, our teacher is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Why are we talking about music? Why are we talking about Snoop? She's not even sophisticated or cool enough to probably know a single Snoop lyric, which I didn't. I just knew that they knew. Then came the movie, then came the athlete, then came the icon, then came the Marvel character. And after enough silly questions about pop culture, I took a deep breath and the questions got real quick. Stand on the line if you know someone who suffers. And just like that movie, and just like that Marvel character, every single student stood on that line, regardless of their shape, their size, their color, their hue. And that someone was them. Each and every one of my students had a story. So many of them knew what it felt like to go home, open that fridge, and there's nothing there. To turn on a light switch and electricity's been cut yet again. To want to take that hot shower, that warm bath, and the gas has been cut again. To want those jeans, those shoes, those video games. But realizing if I ask for those jeans, those shoes, those video games, what is my hardworking mom going to sacrifice? What is she going to go without? So in that moment, in that silence, was solidarity. So many of my students were shouting in the silence. It was deafening, and I heard them simply by seeing them, because seeing them meant I saw their story. And most of those questions I asked started with the word someone deliberately. Someone could give them an out. Someone could be a friend. Someone could be a relative. Someone could be someone they sat next to in class or even rode that bus to school with. And then I slipped. I used the word you, and you was really personal. It's very familiar. Stand on the line if you have ever been homeless. And out she came. Out she came like she had done for each and every question. That song, that movie, that Marvel character, that someone. And when she got to the line, like it was prime time real estate, she stood there, and in that moment, those seconds must have felt like hours. Because in that moment, she realized, I am all alone. Like Sherrod in that chair, I think she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. I think she just wanted to disappear. As she looked at her feet, she said there was a movie in her mind, one that she'd seen over and over and over again. She knew that ending. She didn't want to see anyone, and she certainly didn't want them to see her. because seeing her meant they'd see her story. Seeing her meant that they knew that she was that girl that didn't know where she was going to sleep tonight. Seeing her meant that they would know that she was that girl that didn't know what she was going to eat today. Seeing her meant that they would know that she was that little girl who didn't have clean clothes, who didn't have a shower, who didn't even have quarters for milk. In that moment, those seconds that must have felt like hours, somebody stood beside her. And by standing beside her, in that moment, their eyes locked, and it was this unspoken story. I'm not alone. I'm not the only one that has to reckon with these feelings, to bury that shame, to be a secret bearer. And as the two of them stood beside, others joined them. And in that moment, I realized I need to see them. I need to help them heal. How can I take this classroom, room 203, and make it safe? How could we be each other's brothers and sisters keepers? And for so many of you at home today, what our teachers are not seeing when they just see a blank screen on a computer, we often don't see those stories. We often don't see those kids look away. We don't know about food insecurity at a home when they can't get there early and get that breakfast or have that lunch. And so what I wanted my students to know is that I saw, that I listened in the silence, and somehow, some way, we were going to try to heal together. We were going to be whole together. So just like Carlos, when I talked to Eric and Anna, I said, I want to show stories of my students. And so another beautiful boy in the midst of this pandemic showed up at our office. His car is not as fancy as Carlos, but he's no longer homeless. And in fact, he married a freedom rider, and they have 2 babies, like 100% full on freedom rider babies. He got to be the father he never knew. He got to be the husband his mom always wanted. He got to be the dad he always craved. So when Narada sat down, I said, Narada, can you tell these fine folks in the 6th district, what was that moment? Carlos had his moment of raising his hand. What was the moment for you? I knew what it was going to be. I just wanted him to tell you. It was that line. It was that moment. It was that reckoning, standing beside Sue, but something else. The day before that line, I had given him this marble journal. I'm an English teacher, and I wanted my students to start telling their stories, write what needs to be written, and somehow, some way tell what needs to be told. When that bell rang and Narada had stepped off that line and the day was over, he didn't return to a house, to a home, but to a shelter. And with a marbled journal in hand and a pen, he began to write and write and write. The shame of being homeless, the fear of stepping off a bus and having his friends know he didn't have those shoes, those jeans, that new haircut. And so the second scene that Narada wanted to tell was this moment where we did a toast for change. While Narada was busy writing, I was busy driving around town, trying to find plastic champagne glasses and sparkling apple cider. Standing on that line was painful, but I wanted to turn that pain into purpose. I wanted that pain to somehow, some way be a passion. So as he wrote, I drove around, and with coupons in hand, I got that sparkling apple cider here, those plastic champagne glasses there, and I had books. These books were going to be to bestow on my students that they could read the pain of others, other kids in other places who'd gone through so much. What I did not realize in the midst of this toast for change, that Narada would stand in front of each and every one of us holding that journal, reading those words, and those words eventually would be the anchor for the Freedom Writer's Diary, Diary 24. What we did in our diary that was so amazing, which you'll see in just a moment, is each and every one of my students wrote anonymously. They chose to be a number rather than a name, because anonymity allowed their story to be universal. Anonymity made them feel like a superhero. Anonymity meant that anyone in any place at any time in a dark place could read those words and see the light. So when we had the opportunity to make this incredible story into a movie, Narada had one request: hire real kids. Kids who look like us, kids who talk like us. Don't hire those bratty kids from the Nickelodeon channel or the Disney channel. They're all screwed up. They're all like in the tabloids by the time they're 16 or 18. Hire real kids. So in the scene you're about to see, this beautiful, beautiful boy stands before you, a journal in hand, and the words that he reads, word for word, were not written by some fancy screenwriter in those Hollywood hills. Word for word, he reads Narada's diary, verbatim. But you're going to notice something. The boy that stands before you reading those words doesn't look like Narada, doesn't actually talk like Narada. Narada is African American. The boy reading his words is Latino. But because that story was anonymous, because that story is universal, the boy that you see reading Narada's words, he wasn't an actor. He doesn't walk red carpets. He's not on Disney nor Nickelodeon. At the age of 15, this beautiful boy was homeless himself. And because he read those words, because he brought those words to life, that beautiful boy was able to put a roof over the head of every single one of his family members. So for a moment, I want to introduce you to another one of my adopted boys, another one of my sons, Narada, who came in the midst of a pandemic just for you to tell his story and to bring it to life. So Narada 2 will bring you back into room 203, back into my classroom, to tell you what it was like to stand on that line and to pick up that plastic champagne glass and read those words. So this is Narada.
I would come to school every day and nobody would know. At the time, I was homeless. I'm thinking I'm the only one going through anything. So my goal was not to focus on grades, not to do any of that. My goal was to make sure that I kept this secret hidden and wasn't going to tell anything. And a lot of times I talk about how a piece of tape, a teacher that didn't just show up for a paycheck, completely changed my life.
We're gonna play a game, all right?
The Lion Game. She put that tape across the floor and started asking questions about things that went on in our life.
How many of you know someone, a friend or relative, who was or is in juvenile hall or jail?
So this day on the Lion Game, Ms. Gruwell asked the question, step to the line if you know anybody that's been homeless. Then she told us, stay on the line if that person has been you. And as I was about to step back, I see 2 or 3 people stay on the line. I see another person on the line. And at that point in time, I had to make a decision. It was either step back, hold on to all the depression and the sadness and the feeling helpless, or stay on this line and be set free.
Thank you all very much.
Every time I see that scene, it always forever will take me back to that moment where it went away. It went away. I can start the healing now. I can start the process of actually getting in school and focusing on what I needed to do.
Okay, guys, gals, listen up.
My second most important moment in the movie is the young gentleman that comes forward and he reads a story, talks about him being homeless. That was actually my story. Those were my actual words coming through on the screen.
Her tears hit my shirt like bullets, and told me we were being evicted. I thought I have no home. Why bother coming to school or getting good grades if I'm homeless? Instead, I'm greeted by a couple of friends who were in my English class last year. And it hits me, Mrs. Gruwell, my crazy English teacher from last year, is the only person that made me think of hope. I am home.
What a godsend to have this group of people around me to be there for me, and I knew I had to be strong because I had to be there for them also. That was something I didn't plan on telling a soul, but this is it. This story, this movie, and how it's touched people all over the world. It'll be here forever, long after we're gone.
I'm a little more emotional than I usually am because on my phone, as it's vibrating away, is Narada. You see, in the middle of this pandemic, as these kids kept showing up, they wanted to help, to pay it forward, to understand there are so many kids who look like them and talk like them, who are hurting, who don't know where their next meal's coming from, don't know if this crazy, scary virus is going to make its way into their family, don't know if their parents' jobs are going to survive. So the Freedom Riders wanted to rally yet again, and we started making stuff by, for, and about kids to talk about feelings, depression, anxiety, even with taboos. You know, my big boys were the first to say, we have to lead by example. And if we have to get a little teary-eyed, we will. If we have to get a little misty, we will. In the midst of all of that, this amazing president of a university offered my Freedom Riders, Narada, and all that I've talked about, to have an opportunity to go back to school yet again. So I was Miss G in room 203. Now I am Professor G. And you know what? Narada is my student. And you know who is wrangling him tonight? Sue Ellen. All of those years ago, they stood on a line as strangers. And now they're in college together. And you know what? That beautiful boy's paper was due yesterday, and he didn't finish. And so as I did before, I went out on a limb and I said, you're going to finish. If I have to call you every hour on the hour, I stalked you then and I will stalk you now. Yes, I am Jason from Friday the 13th. They cannot get away from me. But I just got the text. I just got the emoji. I got it. I turned it in. Sue Ellen, she did it. She did it then. She did it now. Because for so many of us, education is a marathon. It's not the sprint. For so many of us, sometimes we fall. But luckily for Narada, Sue Ellen was there to catch him. And she's like a grumpy older sister. Let me tell you, it was not easy to wrangle. But I got the emoji. I got the paper. And Narada's going to get the grade. So when Freedom Riders started treating each other like brothers and sisters keepers, I think it came from a journal. I think it came from Narada standing before us and writing 2 words. For a boy who could have been hopeless at the age of 14, Narada wrote hope. And for a boy who was literally homeless at the age of 14, he wrote the word home. So Narada, like Carlos and Sharad before, taught us that family is what we are going to make. This classroom, this school, this place is safe. And when we fall forward. And when we fall, someone like Sue Ellen is going to be there to catch us. So the last beautiful face I want to show you is about family. We have our makeshift family at school, but we also have our biological family. And I was so blessed to have this beautiful girl come into my classroom, and she was scared. She was going to be the first in her family to graduate. She came from a really big family. Her grandma and grandpa had 14 kids. 14. They lived on a farm. They were poor. They had to hustle. And not one of those 14 children ever made their way to school. Every single one of them was illiterate. When Tanisha was born, this mom had this fear. How am I going to help her with those ABCs and those 1, 2, 3s? How am I going to help her go to school? How am I going to read that sign? How am I going to read those papers? So at the age of 30, her mom began to teach herself how to read, to go to a local community college that would strip away any stereotype or judgment. And so when Tanisha was in my class, beside Carlos and Narada and Sister Sue, she started realizing, oh my God, I'm going to be the first to graduate. I'm going to be the first to go to college. And sometimes that's really scary when people don't look like you or talk like you or come from where you came from. But she did, and she is. And a few days ago, she said, I think I'm going to go all the way. She has that bachelor's degree. She's now working on a master's, and her chosen profession is education. So for a brief moment, I want to introduce you to Tanisha, the first in her family to find her voice, the first in her family to break a cycle. And once she did, she's now pulling everyone along with her. So let's look at Tanisha. She puts the T in transformation, that education can be the greatest way to equalize a very unfair playing field.
Being a freedom rider, it's just nice to know that you always have people in your corner, people that are interested in education and being good people. I am Tanisha Knight, an educated Black woman, an anthropology lover, a basketball player, and I am a freedom rider. My grandmother's side of the family comes from Fort Worth, Texas. She was a farmer. She lived on a plantation where they shared crops. And my grandfather was of Native American descent, and they were really hard workers too. They had 14 children. My grandmother instilled that in my aunts and my mother, the ability to hustle. But my mother was illiterate until she was 30, and she went back to school. She's the only one out of 14 children that actually went back to school to learn and to study. So she's my hero. She came from nothing. You know, we grew up really poor, and now she owns her own property, and she owns 2 cars, and she's really independent. So I wanted to become like her. When I graduated Wilson, I was in varsity basketball. I was one of the top scorers. I actually received a full scholarship at San Diego State. Erin was the first person to hop on and say, if you need me to help you with anything, let us know. And having an awesome mentor like Erin really kept my spirits up. I ended up studying social science to help me understand where I come from and who I am as a woman. And then I received my second degree in anthropology. It ended up being a really, really awesome experience. Right now I'm pursuing my teaching credential in physical education, and after that I will be receiving my master's in education. Ultimately, I would love to get the experience in education so that I can become a professor. My nephew just went to college. He's the second person to go to college in our family. Really proud of him, and got his own scholarship just as I did, and I'm learning that education is key and that it'll take me somewhere in life so that I can provide for myself and I'm able to give back to my community and give back to my family and helping them understand what's going on in the world today.
So even though our story started out with tragedy, those riots, that homicide, that note, I think my students learned to find their voice in a classroom, in school, and have a triumph. And I hope that's why we're all gathered today and throughout this series, to share stories, of the stories of your kids in your community, the kids who were going to be the first to graduate, the kids who are going to be the first to go to college, the kids who are trying to find their voice, like Carlos did all those years ago, the kids who want to stand on a line or stand up, and speak out. And so what I'd love to do now is I'd love to turn it over to you to ask and answer questions. And in fact, there was a question that was posted early on that I've been thinking about, thinking, how do I answer this person's question? So I'm going to do so. It's an anonymous attendee. And they profoundly wrote in the question and answer section, how can parents support teachers so they don't get burned out and see their students as only stereotypes? So as I have done throughout this evening, I share personal stories. So I'll talk about my own parents. You know, when I began teaching, I was overwhelmed. I had so many students with so many issues, and I realized I needed help. And as you saw, as I was building those bricks to my story, I had a Carlos, I had a Narada, I had a Sharada, I had all of these boys. And sadly so, most of these boys didn't have a father in their home. I needed my dad. My dad was involved in our PTA. My dad went on every field trip. My dad signed up for everything. My dad would be in the stands in all my sports games and even when I was a cheerleader. And I'll never forget, he one time was crying in the stands. And when we went out for an ice cream sundae afterwards, I said, Dad, why were you crying? And he said, I'm just so proud. I feel like my heart is going to leap out of my chest. I know that feeling. You as parents know that feeling when your heart is going to leap out of your chest. For a lot of my boys, they didn't have a parent who was that cheerleader, that therapist, that counselor, that wrangler. So I asked my own dad, help me, come with me on these field trips, teach my boys how to tie a tie, how to pull out a chair for a lady, how to go through life with dignity. And so my dad did. On every trip and everything we did, we made our own PTA. So my challenge for each and every one of you, whether you are a teacher or you are a parent, is to ask and to volunteer. For the teachers, we have to ask for help, and it's hard and it's intimidating and it's scary. For you parents, you gotta volunteer. You gotta show up. And once I got my own dad to show up, I got every mom to come along as well. And so I think for all of you, I think you have to work together. I think you have to ask and volunteer and be a unit. We are only as strong as our weakest link. So we've got to help those struggling teachers like myself who didn't know anything. I didn't know how to work the copy machine then, and I don't really know how to work it now. So every once in a while, we have to swallow our pride, look to those of you that can make it better and make it easier and make us more of a family. So I hope I answered your question. What I'd love to do now is you can either unmute, you could type a question into the Q&A section. I'd love to continue if you guys will have me to bring this story to life for you in your very community. The Freedom Riders and I have been very blessed to travel throughout the 6th district. So we know your schools, we know your students, we know your cities. And in this pandemic, as your kids are home and struggling and wondering what it's going to be like when they go back to school behind that shield with that mask or do a hybrid model, it's going to be a little weird. It's also going to be wonderful to see, to interact, to be part of something that's bigger than themselves. So I'd love to turn, Eric, if you could be so bold, if you could help me read some of these questions as they come in.
Yeah, so everyone go ahead and please put your questions in the Q&A. We'll continue to do a little housekeeping while you guys do that. So 10 of the attendees this evening, can you guys see it? Kind of can see it. Let me turn off my virtual background. So 10 people will be that attended this evening will be reaching out to you. You guys will be receiving a 20th anniversary edition of the book signed by Erin with a card about the Freedom Writers Foundation. We just really want to thank Erin. It's so special. And when we heard your story at California State PTA Convention, we just knew how personal and how loving and memorable this was to all of us. And working in California education for as long as we have as advocates and as volunteers, we know we're all fighting the hard fight, but the beautiful thing is we still show up to that hard fight and we're still here to tackle that hard fight. We also are going to be doing a watch party next week, next Wednesday from 7 to 8, and Erin will be on chat and chatting with all of you. So if we don't get to your questions this evening, you'll have another opportunity to do that as well.
Can I do a special shout out to Pepe Yu? She just wrote in the chat room, for my 8-year-old daughter, Quinn. I love your story. You have a kind heart. Oh, well, thank you, Quinn, and thank you, Pepe. I hope you guys can join us next week for a watch party. I think that my heart leaps out of my chest almost daily. So I thank you for that. Eric, would you do me the honors and read Janet Segura Herrera's information? It was so sweet. And
yes. She said tonight was the first time she heard about the movie. She's going to watch it with her family, and she identified in many ways since she's one of the few members in her family that had an opportunity to finish high school. Thank you for your time and testimony.
Oh, thank you, Janet.
Anna, do you want to ask the next question?
Sure.
Question.
This is from Hulda. It says, thank you so much, Erin G., for sharing. You have shown how important the relationship with students is. Narada's point about honesty, how truth set him free, not hiding his struggle. How can the school foster a climate where people can open up when there are a lot of other priorities and pressures regarding grades, etc.?
It's a great question. I think for me, what I learned really early on is I had to go to the heart of where my students were. There was so much pain then. Like I said, there was racial inequality. There were riots, people in their comfort zones. And I realized as an English teacher, I needed to find stories that spoke to my students, that spoke about things that mattered. So I threw everything out and started over. I found books written by, for, and about kids, whether it was Anne Frank in an attic, Zlata Filipovic in a basement in Bosnia, or even Elie Wiesel on a cattle car going into Auschwitz-Birkenau. All of those stories address stories that my students understood to be different, to be picked on, to be the last one picked to be on any team, and what felt like to be the first one picked on. And so I think it's really important to listen to our students, to understand their social, emotional learning needs. And I think as we start going back into our classrooms and into our schools, we're going to have to really listen. Our kids have been hurting. Our kids are dealing with depression like they've never experienced, anxiety, and fear of the unknown. So I think it's going to be a growing period. It's not normal, but in this abnormality, I think we need to lead with our heart. I think we need to teach with our heart. And I think we need to listen with our heart.
We have a comment from Moselle in the chat. Erin, I'm an art teacher and I always show your movie, Freedom Writers, when I do a social political lesson with my students. It transcends time. Students always love it and it speaks to their realities.
Oh, it's been really fun during the pandemic to have the Freedom Writers come back and reflect. Having Carlos relive that moment, it's amazing. Having Narada talk about being on that line and then reading his journal. So what I love about this movie is the attention to detail. You know, the freedom riders were right there. Every word had to have their stamp of approval. Every song in the soundtrack, every outfit, every actor. And so I think it was really important for us to get it right. So it would be just that it would transcend time, that it would be something that would be universal. And I think I attribute that to the freedom riders. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain by saying, this is our story. So portray it with dignity. And it's really made them become incredible activists. In this pandemic, they have used their voice in so many ways. We've been able to wrangle them to make podcasts. We've been making these live events that we call Freedom Forums. And just today, the Freedom Riders decided that we are going to do a special emergency podcast to talk about that horrible shooting in Atlanta. And one of the beautiful young women in our film, named Jackie Nguyen, who played one of my Cambodian refugees, is going to join us on a panel to talk about Asian hate. So we do a lot of crying here in the Freedom Riders world, but we also use our voice and our platform for good. And our hope is that teachers and kids and parents feel that they can be an activist, feel that ordinary people have the capacity to be extraordinary.
Right. There was one in the Q&A, and it was just short and simple. I wish I had you as a teacher.
Oh,
Yes, I do too. I do too.
thank you.
And I think that was from Beatrice. I'm trying to figure out this
It was, yeah.
this Q&A thing. So anyway, another one is from Lena. My experience as elementary on East Side San Jose is not different than you. I have to say I have turned a student annually to Child Protective Services, even going to court to support. It starts so much earlier, and I need my students to be able to trust me and share with me. How do you create that environment when the elementary babies cannot speak out in front of others?
You know, it's a beautiful question, and it's a painful question. In the midst of this pandemic, my colleagues and I, and the Freedom Riders, deliberately chose to teach social emotional learning online to foster youth, knowing they were the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. And many of those foster babies were in elementary school. It's hard. It's hard when kids see things they shouldn't see, hear things they shouldn't hear, experience things they shouldn't experience. And so I think it's up to us to create that safe environment. It's tough when you have to call Child Protective Services. It's tough when you notice that a kid is self-harming. It's tough when you see bruises and cuts and licks and wounds. But our kids need to be safe. Our kids need to heal. And I think that's what I learned. We've had to fill out some of those forms this very year. You know, it's hard when you are trapped in a home with a perpetrator, when everyone's locked up and you don't have that escape of going to school and having that laughter. And so I think for a lot of kids who are coming back to school, they'll be able to breathe. They'll seek you out. You will be the light in what's been very dark for some folks. And so even though you have to fill out those forms, and even though sometimes their stories are really painful, it is a blessing. You know, my father said a line that was captured in the movie beautifully. And he said, "You are blessed with a burden." And I didn't understand that then, but I understand that now. You know, it's difficult to get kids the help they need because they love their parents. They don't want to snitch. You know, on the streets, they say snitches get stitches. The kids also get stitches in those homes with those parents in those dark places. So my hope is that school is always the light. School is always the sanctuary, and that we as parents, educators, and adults can be that safe space for each and every one of our kids.
We have another question from Gianne that says, thank you for sharing the stories. How can I encourage my middle schooler to express their feelings in writing or sharing instead of keeping it to themselves or being angry and bottling it up?
You know, I think what was so important for the freedom writers in this little journal, like us, you know, probably 25 cents, was even though I was an English teacher, it wasn't about rules. You know, those commas will come. We'll fix spelling later. I wanted it to be this stream of consciousness and just write. And I think when I stripped away the rules and they weren't going to get in trouble and my pen wasn't going to bleed all over their paper, it was cathartic. It was freeing. And I started reading stories from other people. I didn't realize how the freedom writers would listen and learn and become better writers because they ultimately became better readers. So seek out those stories. The Freedom Writers Diary was written by and for and about kids. And I think when kids have found or discovered this book, they often find their own story. And I always tell them, if your story is not in this book, then it's up to you to write it. You have to write what needs to be written. You have to tell what needs to be told. And so that's what's really exciting. I think if you strip away some of those rules and make it this safe place, it will be cathartic for them as well.
All right, from Julie, she writes, I loved hearing how your dad showed up when you asked him so that boys could have a male role model. It sounds like you have a wonderful family. Who do you turn to when you're feeling like you need support? Is your dad still involved with your students? I loved hearing about him because my father died in 2007 and I miss him. But I stand up because him showing me how. Thank you. I wish we had more adult male role models for kids since so many of us are female. I think it's so important.
Where's that hanky that you talked about, Eric? You know, my students needed my dad. My dad at one point had played professional baseball. So he was this kind of macho man, but he was also so tender. And as my students called me Miss G, they gave my father the nickname Papa G. And Papa G literally went everywhere. And he often called it wrangling cats. But everyone wanted to sit by Papa G. Everybody wanted to ride with Papa G. And at times he would be snarky, and he put the lovable and lovable curmudgeon. My father was not thrilled when I decided I wanted to be a teacher. He had groomed me to be a lawyer, and he bought me pearls to go into that courtroom and stand in front of a judge and a jury. And instead I chose to go into a classroom and stand in front of a chalkboard, usually with chalk on my butt, in front of my students. And so as I started changing, so did my dad. And that's that line, a blessing and a burden. And so my father, unfortunately, had a heart attack and died suddenly. And the most beautiful celebration of life was when each and every freedom writer stood up and told their favorite Papa G story, and sang songs. Not only was he my dad, but he was a dad to all of them. And so when I usually talk about my dad, even though I'm still an English teacher, I talk about my dad in terms of is. I'm not ready for it to be a was. So I think for any of us who ever lost somebody, they are with us. They are with us always. So I wear the pearls in his honor. When I get really insecure or have an imposter complex, I just make sure that Papa G is close to my heart. And I think that for you, having lost your own father in 2007, he's with you. He is with you always. So what I do is I still write in my journal, but I write to my dad. I write to my Papa G so that he can live all of these things together. And so tonight I get to write about all of you in District 6 who are just trying to make it a little bit better for each and every one of your kids. Eric, where is that Kleenex that you have?
I would hand you mine, but it won't get very far.
Green. I'm looking. I'm going to resort to my sleeve.
We'll follow that up with a very positive that was put into the chat by one of our great presidents. She hopes that every child has a teacher like you in their lifetime because you make such a difference. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm just so honored to be a part of this tonight. Talking to Eric and Anna, getting ready for this, like I had chills. And what they definitely portray is the love of your community, the love of those that you humbly serve. And I insert humbly into serve because it is with great humility. We don't take anything for granted when you send us your babies, your beautiful babies. It's a little gift with a big red bow. So in getting ready for tonight and our watch party, I was just so honored to know the faces that we'd be seeing tonight and the stories that we were going to share. And my hope is that if you know somebody next week that wants to join us and have a courageous conversation, watch that film, have some Kleenex on hand, sticky fingers from popcorn et al. To be a part of that, to be a part of that celebration of school. I believe that we can all be a phoenix rising from the ashes. My students were, so many of us are, and we need to have that for our students. And so this is the time when your kids start going back incrementally, this is the time that they too need to be a phoenix and they need to soar. And maybe all of us can just be the wind beneath their wings, kind of pushing them and nudging them to fly a little higher.
Thank you. Hey, one last question. I think it's really important. Well, they're all important, but this one kind of touches in tune with me. Hi, I would like to know if you use faith in your teaching and storytelling. Thank you for bringing light where it is dark.
I love that metaphor, and I use light and dark a lot. I believe that I am an optimist, sometimes shamelessly so, and that can get me into trouble. Mm-hmm. But I realize that for a lot of my students, they are in the dark and they suffer from depression, the kind that is crippling, the kind where your body hurts, the kind where you don't even want to get out of bed, face the day. And so I told you a little earlier that I was wrangling. I was Jason from Friday the 13th. And there's a beautiful boy. For any of you that get the book, let me show you right here. This is my beautiful Tony. My sweet Tony is in my class. And he is the comedian. If there's laughter, he's usually right in the center. He's always telling a joke. He's always making people laugh. And he's always hurting. He puts on a face. He puts on a front. He puts on a facade because Tony suffers from depression. 2 weeks ago, Tony went missing. And I just kept calling and calling and calling. And he just said, "Mom, I'm hurting. I'm hurting." And so I said, "Let's talk it out." And he talked and I cried, and then I cried and he talked, and he laughed and I laughed, and there was more tears. And then the very next day, he said, I just needed to be found. I just needed you to come looking. So I think for all of us that are in the light and standing in the light, we got to share that light. We got to be the mirror and reflect it onto others. For those that go missing, we got to find them. We got to find them. And when we do, we just got to love on them. We just got to listen to them. We just got to let them know that they are part of something that is bigger than themselves. So I hope that for each and every one of us, we can take away a little spark tonight, a little bit of light, and cumulatively and collectively, we can shed that light in your District 6. We can shine that light so bright that each and every one of those kids, like Tony, has someone that's going to find them and someone who's going to light that path. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Tonight was just such a fabulous night, and grateful for your inspiration and your goodness, and hope that we can take it all back and bring it to our own communities. I want to thank John Paul, and I also want to thank, and I don't know if Sue Ellen is on, but I know that we met with Sue Ellen earlier, and I want to thank her for her help in getting all this set up. And thank you again. And Eric and I had watched the Freedom Riders a couple weeks ago, and had our box of Kleenex and our sticky fingers with our buttered popcorn. And after seeing this, makes me want to do it all over again. But we love you. We're grateful for you. Grateful for your dad. Grateful for all your kids that inspire us and show goodness, which is what we need in this world right now. Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you and get my box of Kleenex.
I put into the chat just another sweet message to continue on, but it's from Dear Evan Hansen, the song You Will Be Found, and that also just leaves such a lasting impression with the message that you share with us, Erin. And so we thank you all again for joining us. Again, with PTA's mission, it's to serve every child with one voice. So that's the spirit we want to leave with. And we'll be sending out an email to the recording link, and then we'll also be inviting you all to the watch party. So please invite your friends, and Erin is gracing us with her presence once again, and we'll be able to interact with all of us next Wednesday night. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much. I'm going to wear waterproof mascara next time. That's my pledge. Thank you all. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for the love. Go find those babies.
There you go. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Aw.